So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Actually, I was told by Glenn Ross that he thought he ought to come and talk to us at Jackson Day, but because Fred's got a bunch of weapons here, I didn't think it was a great idea to take them down to Baltimore and scare all the locals to death with them. So I said, but you can come here because I even have a canyon in my front yard. So I want to introduce Fred Gady, who has been on TV, he's been on Chesapeake Collectibles, been a reenactor for how many years?
Well, I started in the Centennial, so that was 56 years ago.
56 years. He has a little bit.
But I stopped it a long time ago.
He has a little bit of experience as a reenactor, but as a collector, he's been doing out of Goodwill too, and he has some really neat stuff here. And then afterwards, if you have questions, you can come up and point to something and say, can you give me a little more information about that piece or whatever. So, with no further ado, Fred, take it.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the very nice introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to do a presentation for the 1812 Society. I know that many of you are aware of the rich history that Marylanders have in our nation's history, going back to the 18th century when Marylanders were personally selected by George Washington to form the core of the Southern Army that Nathan Greene used to thwart the British and to, at Cowpens, eventually get the British on the defensive and eventually go back to Yorktown. So we go back a long way. But one of the high points of our military history is the War of 1812. And of course, the Battle of North Point and the defense of Baltimore in September of 1814. So what I'm going to do today is share with you some of my artifacts, some of the anecdotes that I've accumulated. And, you know, it's not as long as the 6-hour presentation that I usually make, but I think you'll understand when I keep it down a little bit. I am joking. The War of 1812 and the defense of Baltimore it's really a unique experience because there were very few regular Army soldiers involved in the defense of Baltimore, and those were with Armistead at Fort McHenry, the artillerymen. Everybody else was militiamen, not only from Baltimore, but from almost all of the surrounding states. They came to support Sam Smith and the group that was assembling on Hampstead Hill, otherwise known as Hobkirk's Hill. The interesting thing is that Smith had been named Brigadier General in charge of the Maryland militia system in 1794, right after the militia system was created for the state. And he really didn't do much in the way of planning for a defense of Baltimore specifically, because he figured that the British, even though they hated us as the nest of pirates, they would never get here. Well, after Washington was burned at the end of August, he had to change his mind right away, and on August 24th, put out the word, we need help. So the entrenchments that you see the remnants of on Hampstead Hill were started on August 26th. The battle was September 17th. So he did not have a long time to prepare, which is amazing when I found out that fact. They actually had somebody who had a large plow, and the plow helped them do a lot of the trenching, because I wondered how they put a mile of trenching in place in about 2 weeks. So I've never been able to find anything more about the plow, but the point is there was one around. Somebody had one. We just only have one reference to it. But Smith was really a key to this entire project. If you've not seen it, I'm sure most of you probably have seen pictures of Sam Smith, but he was a remarkable Marylander, governor, senator, just did lots of things. But as Brigadier General, he organized what was going to happen and where it was going to happen on Hampstead Hill. And ultimately, with the other troops that assembled there, the total of about 15,000, they were able to basically scare the British away. And that happened because Ross, who was killed at Battle of North Point, his subordinate Brooke was over by Bayview. That's where Ross's camp was, Bayview. So he could see all the activity going on Hampstead Hill with telescopes. And he saw all this activity, and he saw 34 cannon in line that had been brought from ships in the harbor. And he realized, well, and then the British commander, Cochrane, said, it's up to you. You decide whether you want to do it, because I couldn't reduce Fort McHenry. If you want to proceed, do it. Well, Brooke said, I don't think we can do it, because they had that long sloping hill coming up. The entrenchments were like 6 to 10 feet deep in places, and he just decided, we're going to leave. So it was a remarkable achievement in that short space of time to create the impression that they were in an impregnable situation. So what I'm going to show you is some of the muskets first that the soldiers would have had, one of which I'm sure was at the Battle of North Point. And so the first one, well, this one's not the right one to pick because it doesn't quite go on right. It should go on like that. That's the proper orientation for a bayonet on the musket. But anyway, I wanted you to see how long this is. And it weighs about 10 to 13 pounds, depending on the type of model. But this particular one is actually an obsolescent French musket. It's a 1763 Charleville. But what's interesting, and that means basically it has this extra hump on it. If you notice, the other two do not. They have lower, what's called the comb. The combs are lower, but this is a very early 1763 Charleville, and it's got Maryland branded on the stock, which means that it was in storage when Waters, after the battle, started marking the muskets, and we believe that that's when they started branding them and also putting Maryland M's on them. You'll see one of those as well, and when you come up you can see it. But this musket, we know, had been in federal hands from the Revolution, that it had been one of the 100,000 muskets that came in from France, and it sat in Schuylkill Arsenal. It's got inspection marks right here, IP for Perkins, IN for Nicholson. It still has the original French Army acceptance mark on it, so we know it started in France. It's got the original stock on it, and basically it sat in Schuylkill Arsenal till probably the early 1800s, when the state of Maryland bought about 7,500 muskets from the federal government over a series of years. And that's one of the important things to point out, that Maryland was very proactive about creating a defensive militia. It not only created one of the first militia systems with 50 regiments being designated, there were recruiting districts throughout the state of Maryland, with Baltimore being the third largest city in the state, having the most regiments devoted to it. The 5th, 6th, 27th, 39th, and 51st regiments were from Baltimore City, which was a lot considering some of them had one maybe they could field. So Baltimore was a very important city and lived up to its fame because it was the Baltimore City regiments that ended up going down to North Point and with Stricker and delaying the British for them to get a couple more days worth of entrenchments done. But anyway, so this is one of the typical muskets that would have been bought from the federal government and left over. It was obsolescent, even though it was flintlock, which means that the flint in this jaw hits the steel right here and creates a spark that goes into this pan that ignites the powder in the barrel, and that sends the ball down here. And I'm going to pass around a musket ball. In fact, I'll pass around War of 1812. Because there's nothing like being able to handle things and not just see them behind glass and where you have to wear white gloves and all of them. So anyway, this is a very significant musket, not only because very few of these early Charlevilles were made, but we can trace from the markings on it its history right on up to the War of 1812. We don't know where it was used in the War of 1812, but we know it was probably there. Now,
Do you think it's used in the Revolution as well?
I don't think it did. It's in too good a shape, to be honest with you. And they not only had, not given, they were given loans to buy them, but basically they were given 100,000 muskets. They also given parts for another 100,000, and they were actually assembling French-style muskets up into the early 1800s. And so if you're a collector, you have to differentiate whether it's a Revolutionary War musket, which that one clearly is, or one that was assembled later. But anyway, this one we know is definitely it. The state bought 4,000 muskets in 1798, and then in 1809 authorized purchasing 6,000 more muskets for arming the militia. There were two parts to the militia. The common militia, which meant everybody was enrolled, and you signed you were put on a roll, and you were supposed to have musters, but probably never showed up for one. And then you had the volunteer companies, and the volunteer companies are the ones that have the uniforms and are the ones that form the bulwark of the troops, virtually all of them, down at North Point. You can see they've got uniforms, and they paid for them themselves. And in fact, in 1974, I came across the original of this belt plate in a museum, and it was not very well secured. So the very first article I ever wrote was about this belt plate, because I wanted to be sure that it had a history, that it was state property, and in case it ever disappeared, nobody could say, oh, I've had it for 20 years. So 1974, I had to started my research, which is always continues. I'll pass this around for you. It says 5th Regiment, BUV, Baltimore United Volunteers. And then GTD is George T. Dunbar. So we knew nothing about Dunbar. I've actually found a painting of him. Because these guys with silver breastbelt plates were the up-and-coming merchants, assistants, lawyers. They were the younger people who could afford a silver breastbelt plate. Most of them couldn't. And so consequently, they also might have had a painting done of them as well. But this particular plate, like I said, the original, when I had custody of it, I had a casting made of it, because I knew that beyond that it was going to be behind glass where it should have been. Anyway, I'm going to pass this around so you can take a look at it. This is a reproduction, it's not an original. But I'll pass around a couple of the original 1812 breastbelt plates that are on this original set, the bayonet belt. You can see it in place right there, and you'll see the plates. You can handle the plates, but they're exactly the same. Most of them were made by George Green and Son. He had a huge contract during the War of 1812. So I'm going to start, and by the way, one has a little bit of an edge to it. The other one is kind of smooth. We believe that these larger ones were used as masters to cast more of these, because brass shrinks, and therefore these are a little smaller, and we think that's why there's two different sizes, because they got knockoffs because they needed more. And Green could only turn out so many plates. So the states authorized 6,000 muskets, in addition to the 4,000 that they bought in 1798. 1809 comes along, and they said you can basically, the purchasing people, you can get them anywhere you want. You know, you can get them from people who are importing muskets, and if they're the right pattern and are serviceable, we'll buy them. But the first 3 years, they didn't get any offers from merchants or gunsmiths or anybody. So 1809, 10, and 11, they bought them from the federal government. They bought 1,200 of them, so there was 3,600 more. Then in 1813, an enterprising gentleman by the name of Joseph Henry figured out a way that he could help the state and he could help himself. He knew, because he was a manufacturer as well, that there were a lot of other makers who had 1808 musket contracts who had gotten money from the federal government to help them get their operations working right and funded and all that. And that he could basically, they were getting $10.50 a musket from the federal government. And he told them, I'll give you $11.50. And then he told the state, his contract says $12.50. So he was doing a little arbitrage right there and making a buck. And the contractors are going, well, I don't care if the federal government paid for the proofing of this barrel or gave me money as an advance to get these things made. I'm going to make more money if I sell them to Henry. So therefore, that's what they did, a lot of them, to the tune of about over 2,000 muskets. This one was made by a company, by Group Owen and Edward O. Evans. And as you can see, it's also got the Maryland brand on the stock. And it also has, I'll get into this later, but the Maryland M, the iconic Maryland M on the barrel as well. So for years, I'm saying 25, 30 years, those of us who were interested in this couldn't figure out why there were so many different makers' names. Evans, Jenks, I mean, it was like 15 of them. And some that we really never found out about, Grisky, for example. We couldn't figure out why all these different names until I had a friend, Luke Clausen, at the Hagley Museum in Delaware, and I said, Luke, you've gotten the Henry papers. I know he's been associated because I see him in the ordnance records for state of Maryland. Look and see if you can find any connection between Henry and the state, because I've not found a contract from the purchasing people, from the legislature, from the governor. I mean, it just didn't exist. About a month later, he says, yeah, it came from his privy council. It's like the cabinet. They issued a contract to Henry to provide 1,000 muskets every 6 weeks till they said, no, you know, we're going to stop. Well, Henry was no fool. He knew that he couldn't make that many muskets himself that quickly. So he went to all his buddies that I just mentioned and gave them the deal that I described. And they all, not all of them, but a lot of them diverted some of their productions. The Evans, for example, diverted 433 muskets to the state of Maryland from what they should have been delivering to the federal government. And it's a very interesting story about how they sorted all that out, because the federal government's going, wait a minute, you're defaulting on your contracts, we're going to call your bonds. I mean, it got messy. But anyway, this is one of those ones that, of the 2,000 that Henry, let's see if this goes on here. I just want to show you the correct orientation. No, this one doesn't fit either. That shows you that they're all basically hand fitted, but there are, the barrels and the bayonets usually are oriented with a bayonet on the right side. But again, this is one of the, what I call the consortium, and I'll pass this around. So after I located this, what I call the Rosetta Stone about these muskets, I and a friend of mine, Dick Marsden, I said, Dick, I'm going to go up to the Gettysburg National Military Park, because they have an original Henry that's in the, if you've ever been up there, the old visitor center, they had this wall of muskets, we called it. And one of them was this Henry. And they were going to build the new visitor center. They had taken it off display, and I got permission to come up and photograph it and examine it. And so I called Dick and I said, Dick, you have the largest collection in the U.S. of socket bayonets. These are socket bayonets because they've got this tube on the end, as opposed, so that slides over the barrel. He says, great, I'll bring some of my bayonets along and we'll try them out on the Henry and see if we can make a fit, because we didn't really know what the bayonets were either, because a lot of them really weren't, they're not really marked. So this is a picture of Dick right here. He passed away a few years ago, and he made sure that I was able to buy all of his bayonets. So it's a three-part article. It's exhaustive, and I'm not going to bore you with all. You can just look at whatever you want and pass it around. But that was the culmination of all the research that Dick had done on bayonets and that I had done on the muskets. We put it together, and we published a few for a special meeting, but I don't have any extras at this point, so I'm sorry they've all gone over time. The third bayonet, the third musket is very interesting.
Did you find the bayonet that fit the musket?
Yes, we did, and 254, this is it. That's the bayonet that he fitted on the musket up at Gettysburg, and was our, and the distance from the muzzle to the sight, or the bayonet lug, and on top of the end of the stock, everything was perfect, and it matched the basic criteria that we noticed on. I've now located about 60 muskets that are definitely marked to Maryland, either with the M or with other markings like Hazlitt in this case, that were definitely owned or used by Marylanders during the War of 1812. So that was a real breakthrough, and we wanted to make sure that this knowledge didn't just, wasn't in our brains forever and then it was gone. So that's why we published this three-part article to make sure that it was available for posterity. But in the course of that research, we found this particular musket, which was interesting because it doesn't have any of the Maryland marks on it. And we wondered, well, wait a minute, Hazlitt, that rings a bell. He was a Baltimore gunsmith who moved here from Philadelphia in 1803 and set up shop on Water Street under the sign of the Golden Gun. I would love to have seen that sign or a picture of it. But anyway, so this is definitely the same Hazlitt. And in 1813, I was going through the state archives and I came across a receipt for him repairing 313 of these muskets for the city of Baltimore, not for the state of Maryland. And he marked them, because I've now located 4, so they all have the Hazlitt mark. But more importantly, it's a little hard to see, but they're marked Regiment, 39th Regiment. And the 39th Regiment was one of the reserve regiments at the Battle of North Point that then, when the British started to flank the left flank of the Americans, they were moved up into line with the 39th and the 51st, which they're shown in this copy of Ruckels's paintings. You've probably seen the Ruckels paintings down at the Maryland Historical Society. That's what these are. So the 39th Regiment, this one, I'm absolutely positive was at the Battle of North Point. And like I said, out of the 313, I know of at least the 4 at this point. This is one of the 4. But it's a sleuthing. It's putting little, what I call bricks in the wall together until you actually have enough of a wall that you can figure out what are you looking at. Now, believe it or not, I didn't get started in my research in muskets. I got into it through accoutrements. And I know you ladies have an interpretation of what that word means. The dangles and baubles and all that stuff, right? Well, accoutrements to military collectors are the cartridge boxes, the bayonet scabbards, and things like that. And so This is an original War of 1812 cartridge box, and I'm going to pass a reproduction of one around to you so that you can actually open it up and take a look at it. And this is where the cartridges would have gone that had that ball that's going around somewhere, probably in the back. But anyway, this pattern was used from 1808 until 1837. I'm sorry, 1828. But the style was used all the way till 1837. But it's got a wooden block inside. So it has a wooden block to carry 26 cartridges. They're paper wrapped so that the soldier would have torn off an end, poured the powder out, squeezed the ball out. Well, he would have primed it first. He would put a little bit of powder in the pan that I talked about to prime the gun, and then put the cartridge down, and then he would have been ready to fire. He also had a little opening in the front here with a tin case underneath of it so that you could have put oiled rags for cleaning or extra flints or anything small. You could also have put another 3 or 4 cartridges on either end, so you could have gotten your capacity up to about 30 rounds. And some of them, this was kind of a new innovation, have these earpieces on the side of the cartridge to help try to keep the moisture out because, again, they're paper wrapped, so they're very susceptible, and there was a lot of ammunition lost because of rain, and they were in casks, and they got banged around in wagons. I mean, it was, there's lots of letters about how much ammunition was lost, and you almost wonder how they had enough to fight. At the time, they had, this is true buff, a buff leather cartridge strapping, and I'm going to pass that around while I read a little excerpt. John Pendleton Kennedy was one of the guys that, he was a company mate of Dunbar. So Kennedy would have worn the same breast belt plate, but with his initials on it. And he wrote that, and so my introduction to a lot of this was about Dunbar, but then the Baltimore United Volunteers and whoever else was involved. And Kennedy eventually became Secretary of War of the Navy under Polk in the 50s and helped open the Japanese trade. So he was not an artist, but a poet. So he wrote artistic things as well. Jack of all trades. But he left a partial memoir, and I just want to read real quickly. And by the way, the Baltimore United Volunteers had 3 men killed at North Point, 18 wounded, and 3 taken prisoners. So they were in the thick of it down there at North Point. I mean, they weren't just parade ground soldiers. But he wrote, "Here I was in a very dashy uniform of red and blue." You saw that on the cover. That's my interpretation of what it looks like. "With a jacket and leather helmet, with my white cross belts, pure as pipe clay could make them, my cartridge box and bayonet, and a Harper's Ferry musket of 14 pounds. Interestingly, he was also at Bladensburg the few weeks before, and he talked about that he had put a cold fowl, a piece of tongue, a bottle of wine, and his dancing pumps in his haversack because he was sure that the president would invite them to a ball at the White House after they beat the British." That's in his memoirs. That's kind of cute. Anyway, so I'll pass this around too. This is the insert from another way that cartridges were carried. This would have been for a horseman's cartridge box, and it would have been inside like a little belly box because he needed his arms free with the reins and everything else. So this is the partial remains of one. I'm going to pass around. Now be careful with these because these are sharp. These are bayonets. But what I want to point out to you is that on them, the Maryland M was designated to be put on these guns and bayonets and other things before the war, actually. But we don't know, we don't have any records of it being done until John Waters had a sub-depot in Baltimore City, and he marked 1,600 muskets after the war. I'm sure there must be more receipts than the 1,600 that I located, but I just haven't come across them. But that's where the Maryland M is, and we know that John J. Joseph Henry, again, made 4 of these marks for the state of Maryland, 1 for each of the 3 primary arsenals, and 1 for Waters up at the sub-depot up in Baltimore. So that's, and they're all oriented the same. They're horizontal to the blade. If you see them in other directions, I don't think that they're probably right. A canteen. Now there is a canteen identical to this one. This is a wooden hooped canteen, and it's got initials on it, NTHU. I don't know who that is, but you can see Cooper's made these canteens because they're made just like little kegs or butter containers, things like that, with the wood hoops. This particular one was made by John Slimmer in Philadelphia in 1810, because I've got the contracts for that. And it still has its original stopper. But you can see that the bands interwoven, they're cut so that they can slip together, and that's what holds it together. But there's no glue, only some nails to hold the strapping in place. Later ones have iron bands with iron cross straps, but this is a one, and there is one with Maryland branded on it. So we know this is a style that some of the Marylanders got. I don't have very many uniform pieces, but when I was young and starting to collect, I knew there was pieces that I would never be able to afford to buy. So I just made my own reproductions. And this is one that I made probably 30 years ago now, maybe 40 years ago, of the 1813 tombstone cap that I doubt that very many Marylanders wore, but clearly Armstead's men down at Fort McHenry would have worn something like that, but with red trimmings rather than this. And that's what it looks like. Now, it's hard for me to believe, having worn this, that you got this much top weight, and it was designed not only for dress occasions, but when you were doing fatigue work too. So theoretically, if you're just doing, work in the fort or you were digging trenches, you would have still been asked to wear this, which is crazy to me. But I'll pass this around because it shows you how it was constructed. And this one is an exact duplicate of the one that's in the Maryland Historical Society, including the band, if you see it. It was in the Flag House Museum for many years, and then it got transferred back to the Maryland Historical Society. But this is, like I said, construction-wise, it's all leather, by the way. It's quite heavy. Let me see. I think you've seen the basic things. I promised John that I would keep it to about this much time, but I'll open it up for a few questions at this point, and then you'll be able to come up and ask specific questions if you want to after we finish.
Is there any real difference between the model 1795 and the 1808? I've read some books that say there isn't any difference at all.
It's in very fine points. It's in nuances, to be honest with you. The 1795, was basically made in federal armories, Harper's Ferry and Springfield. The 1808 was the first time that this is an 08 right here. And it was made by contract with a lot of different people involved, and there was no interchangeability of parts, so they were all custom fitted, and so they looked similar, and that's why Henry developed these specifications pretty close, but even they were all hand fitted. So that's why you saw me. I tried 3 bayonets on these muskets, and none of them fit that particular musket. So, but there's not really very much difference, except for a collector who's trying to collect every model and he wants a pure 1795 versus an '08. Well, then he knows what to look for. And the guy who was the first superintendent of Harper's Ferry was Joseph Perkins, and his initials are the ones that I referred to on this French musket. So before he became, in the 1780s, when he was still an armorer, he inspected that gun, and he and Nicholson were paid to repair, replace, fix them up, you know, that kind of stuff in the 1780s. And I've got a number of their reports of how many they did, and they were paid, you know, a small amount for each one to get them back to snuff.
Let me ask about the hat that's going around. What is the what is the fabric inside?
That's actually a linen.
Is it to keep it on?
Well, it creates, it's got a drawstring, so you can adjust it to size. So you have a basic size to your head, but if it's a little loose, you can draw this up a little bit, and it keeps it from falling down over your ears.
Gotcha.
But the thing is, it's leather, and I'm going to pass it back. You had it, because it's much heavier than you realize until you handle one.
Yeah.
You know, you look at the load for the soldier, and you go, you know, they marched all the way to Washington and fought a battle, and then they had to march back, and then you get to the Civil War, and it's unbelievable what soldiers did in the Civil War.
So there's no protection. I mean, that wouldn't protect anyone against a wound, would it?
Well, a little bit if a sword came at you, because it would deflect it. But these are infantrymen, so the cavalry was supposed to keep the like Tarleton's dragoons away from the infantry. Didn't always do it, but they just didn't have fatigue hats at that time. They didn't start developing fatigue hats for the Army until 1825. Any other questions?
In the longer history of bayonets, I mean, they all seem to have a standard design, and even in what would appear to be modern times for color guards and such. When did they start making things that were more like knives?
Well, basically that started in the late 1800s, really about 1890 with the Krag. The Krag Jorgensen had a knife bayonet as opposed to a socket bayonet, and it has the little ring on the end and a clip that you clip it onto the end of the rifle. And well, then you got the 03, and you had the 1917, and then even up through World War II, even up to the present time, you've got the same basic idea with the round hole and the clip that goes on the muzzle of the gun. But that started very late in the 19th century. And you know, then they chrome them and they make them into the color guards and all that. But up till that point, they used the socket bayonet concept, whether it was on the left side or the right side or underneath. There's a lot of nuances, including, you know, the amount of curve to the neck, as it's called, the way, if you notice this one compared to that one, this one's got a longer set of openings to slide on. So it's very difficult if they don't come together to get a bayonet to fit the exact musket. And when Dick and I were up at Gettysburg and his number 254 went on the Henry so perfectly, I mean, every dimension matched. We were like, this is unbelievable. So anyway, but it's, you know, the French, they did things differently. The British had their own system, the Germans, the Prussians, they all vary in details. And there's people that only collect Austrian bayonets, for example. I mean, there's specialists in everything. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, you're welcome to come and ask specific questions if you wish.